in the tricolour, saffron, white and green. This beautiful setup is right now hosting the Ratri Bhoj, or the dinner that's being hosted by the Rashtrapati, Srimati Draupadi Murmu. We've got details of the menu there, and it's clearly the Sharad Ritu menu that's been followed there. There is a cultural extravaganza. We should get pictures. It will go late into the evening till about 10:30. We're given to understand, before as all the leaders will leave for the day and come back for day 2 of the summit, which President Joe Biden once again has tweeted saying that after a productive day 1, I'm looking forward to a productive day 2 at the summit. What are the deliverables? What are the achievables in day 2? One can only understand because most of the big boxes have been ticked. If we were to describe how the day actually went, we've tried to do that in set of pictures. Before we call out the first picture, let me just tell you, the pictures started right at the day, right at the top of the day, because Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed everyone in front of the Konark Wheel, and that itself is hugely symbolic. The warmth with which each of the leaders were greeted itself set the tone that perhaps consensus will prevail over conflict, collaboration, human-centric approach. This message somewhere seemed that it could be delivered. And thereafter, it started soon after Prime Minister Narendra Modi's opening speech, where he talked about India's ancient wisdom, the Vishnu Stambh in Delhi, which in Prakrit talks about the welfare of all human beings should be established or should be ensured, a 2,500-year-old message. And from there he globalized the message of Sabka Saath, and then announced that the African nations will become a permanent member of the G20, and they will sit at the chair through the 2-day leadership summit. The warmth with which the President of the Africa Union, Azali Assoumani, hugs Prime Minister Narendra Modi shows how much the African nations thank India for doing this. And it's all happened within a year, because it was revealed later on through the day that the last time the Africa Union chair, Senegal President, was actually complaining in Bali that African nations and their cause has been ignored. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi promised, saying that it would be taken up during India's year of presidency. And look, by the end before even passing on the baton to Brazil, this has been actualized. The next picture is the Delhi Declaration. Big tick of the box, because many thought with the kind of polarized positions the world has taken, especially around the Ukraine conflict, was it possible to even bring out a joint communique? And that is something the Sherpas have really worked. And Amitabh Kant, the Sherpa of the G20, openly crediting, along with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, openly crediting the emerging nations, saying nations like Turkey, nations like Indonesia, nations like South Africa, they played a key role in making sure that all the other nations, differing nations, came on board for a larger cause. The way the 8 paras of geopolitics have been worded, especially those 2 paras on the Ukraine war, is something which was in agreement for all nations. China and Russia also agreeing to it, and that was significant, that consensus happened. Clearly more than 80 pages in that entire declaration, and Amitabh Kant going on record to say not a single word, not a single para, nothing is contested. Everything is with 100% unanimous agreement, and that is very, very significant. It's a big tick in the box for New Delhi and for Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his team as chair of the G20 presidency. The claim is that this has perhaps been the most productive G20 year of presidency under India ever. 2 to 5 times the time of any other outcomes that have been achieved in the past. Nearly 112 outcomes as detailed by Amitabh Kant ji himself. Moving on, the next picture of the day is the Global Biofuel Alliance. Look at this. This is the Committee of Nations coming together to say that we are going to focus on a cleaner, greener planet with the focus on biofuels. Renewables is going to be the thrust. If the last time around India was the first to move the International Solar Alliance, this time around you see nations who perhaps were opposed to this idea in the past also coming on board and saying we will collaborate, we'll participate and we'll work. So India present there, along with I can see Sheikh Hasina there in the picture. So Bangladesh is there, Italy is there, we've got President Joe Biden, there are representatives from the Middle East and also President Lula of Brazil, all of them in that picture. So it's a big alliance, it's only going to grow. These are the nations who are already part of it. big tick in the box again. Then they said there is another big announcement, and that big announcement came from Prime Minister Narendra Modi with US President Joe Biden as the co-chair, the participation of Saudi Arabia with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sitting to one side of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Then there was Italy, the Prime Minister of Italy present, President of France Emmanuel Macron present. We also had Crown Prince Sheikh Zayed, who was there from the UAE, all of them sitting together and announcing the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. A big announcement of strategic partnership where Japan has said that it is keen to partner, because you had the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also speaking on that occasion. All the leaders saying that this is not just an announcement, we will work towards actualizing it and giving it shape at the earliest. Nations coming together, these nations include Jordan, UAE, the entire Emirati nations. Then there is Saudi Arabia, France, Italy, Germany. Olaf Scholz was also there. All of them strong economies which are rich nations who are ready to partner together to build up an economic corridor that would include ships, rail and road to connect India to the European Union, to all of Europe. So look at that bridge, it will be built, and what it implies, we will talk about it in just a bit, but that's another big picture. Then comes the two big pictures which talk about Sabka Saath, India's ability to solve problems and get differing parties together. The immediate picture was Joe Biden shaking hands with Crown Prince MBS and with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the middle. This is a huge ask and a huge win if these two people can come together, and if India has played the bridge and PM Narendra Modi has played the bridge. That shake hand was never going to come, that's what many thought, but it has happened. So if there can be moving past certain issues and coming back to shake hands for the greater good, it's happened. The next picture was another big one, because Bangladesh, a special invitee here, Sheikh Hasina, has been at the wrong end of the stick with the Biden administration and White House, totally not supportive. But Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina been a very good friend of India, and those equations being normalized, there are smiles and also a selfie. So that's what we've been able to achieve. So there are a lot of boxes to tick, ladies and gentlemen. Even as we peruse through those 80 paragraphs, 38 pages of the joint declaration, there are so many aspects and outcomes that have been agreed upon by nations. And it's just a matter of pride for all of us that nations are coming together and putting what's important, a human-centric approach towards development, and not allowing geopolitics to shadow economic progress of all of humanity, of the entire planet. Green growth, sustainable growth, that's been there, and that's underlined among the 5 key points. Let's go across to our guests to talk a little more and their thoughts. Matt Weiser, reporter, White House, Washington Post. He's traveled with President Biden. He's with us this evening. Vivek Wadhwa, entrepreneur, with us. Fame needs no further introduction, very familiar face, so we'll get his take on the progress that's been made at the G20 platform. After all, it's all about trade and economics. Leela Ponnappa, former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, former diplomat, also with us. Good evening, Ambassador Ponnappa. Professor Victor Gao, Vice President, Center for China and Globalization Chair, Professor Suzhou University, with us at this point. And later in the broadcast, we're hopeful that Falguni Shah, American singer, will also join us, because there is a huge thrust on millets too. But first to Matt Weiser. Matt, how would you look at day one of the G20 summit? A lot of firsts, lots of surprises, pleasant ones at that.
Yes, especially from the U.S. perspective, and talking to a lot of Biden administration officials, they were cautiously optimistic, I would say, about the joint declaration, that it would come at all. I think the fact that it came today and kind of, quite frankly, on the early side. I remember being in Bali a year ago, and it came a little bit later, and there was a lot more tension around it. So the fact that they did come to agreement on it, now there will be some criticism that it doesn't go as harshly against Russia in this. So they had to tone down some of the language, I think, to get everybody on the same page. But the fact that they did, I think, is something that the Biden administration is very pleased with. And then you also outlined the India to Europe economic partnership. That's another big item on the Biden agenda. So that economic corridor, it has been a big item that has come together quite quickly and quietly over the past couple of months, and we're seeing the fruits of a lot of those labors today with that announcement. That, again, from the Biden side, as early as a couple nights ago, they were hopeful that they'd put the pieces together to make that announcement, but we're not positive yet. So the fact that they had those two announcements, I think, were quite significant from their perspective.
Let me just quickly read through the two paragraphs, paragraphs 8 and 9 on geopolitics, which specifically mention the Ukraine war. Importantly, while China and Russia have maintained it's just a conflict or a military operation, the word war was included. So concerning the war in Ukraine, that's how it starts, and I'm reading it verbatim from the document. While recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and at the UN General Assembly, and underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, all states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. The use of threat or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. Reaffirming that the G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation and recognizing that while the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, we acknowledge that these issues can have significant consequences for the global economy. So without even openly naming or being very critical, but all the resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly underscored, Matt. And so that's why perhaps, but critical, that it starts with concerning the war in Ukraine.
It definitely mentions the war in Ukraine, which it calls it a war, and it references Ukraine. I think we're hearing a little bit from some Ukrainians in reacting to it. I think they want it to call out Russia as the perpetrator of the war. That's difficult given that Russia is a member of the G20, and as you pointed out in the introduction, you have to have everybody sign on. So Russia probably is not going to sign on to that. So they had refrained from calling out Russia specifically as the perpetrator of the war. I think China also opposed to that kind of language, but some of that was in the language a year ago. So I think they had to modify it a little bit. But as you point out, it does call it a war, and it does highlight Ukraine, and it highlights the impacts of the war to the people.
Yes, it very clearly says that there is a geopolitical impact, even though it's a trade forum or an economic forum. But more importantly, they say we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly. So the wordings there were very harsh, and they said we are reiterating that position and also what was adopted at the UNSC and UN General Assembly. This has been made possible because of emerging nations, Ambassador Leela Polampa. That is significant, that the foreign minister and the G20 Sherpa very clearly crediting the emerging nations for getting China and Russia to sign in on this.
Absolutely, because the point is, as the G20 itself at its very establishment declared, that it was the primary forum for global economic governance. And despite a highly expanded agenda, which moves from financial stability and monetary issues to virtually everything under the sun, gender, education, health, and so on, the point was that you don't hold this up because of the introduction of politics into it. Because the disclaimer that this is not a forum for political or strategic discussions was there in the Bali Declaration as well. And I think the same holds good over here and in any further G20 discussions. Essentially, what does the para say? It says that we agree to disagree, but we have certain basic norms that everybody abided by. That's what it was.
Yes.
I would think that neither Russia nor China wanted to be spoilers in this particular case. Essentially, what if they had held out, it would have been to exercise a veto, right? And they did not wish to do that in terms of what G20 stands for, which is really work in progress regarding redefining, reinventing, if you would, effective multilateralism. And I'm sure some of the other member countries also said, look, don't hold it up just for this, because this is not the forum to discuss it. We'll take care of it in votes in the UN and wherever else, but not over here.
And we'll underline whatever we have said in the UN. Somewhere do you think that was the compromise, that Russia and China on the one hand, while they were not explicitly mentioned, but it was called a war, not a conflict or a military operation? You think that's where the compromise was?
Frankly, I haven't had the time to compare this with what was said at Bali. If you say the war was introduced, I think that was something that they could let go by. But you also note that it says that national positions were reiterated. So there again, they can go home and say, yes, we held out. We stuck to our guns. That's not meant to be a pun, but that I think this is there was something in it for everyone. They could all go back and say, well, we took care of our interests.
But Ambassador Ponnappa, my question is, has India now shown that it is a conflict resolver, it's a problem solver? When you get into a position of a problem solver, you automatically get into a position of strength. Bharat gets into a position of strength geopolitically. Would you agree?
You know, India has a reputation at all international conferences of ultimately being a very effective player at the drafting stage. Because at the end of every conference, what is the outcome? You know, we've got everything that's happening in Delhi right now. But scholars, researchers, successor officials and so on will all go to the document. What did it say? And this, I think, is one of India's diplomatic strengths. And I have no doubt that it came into play over here. I'm sure our diplomatic colleagues worked at least as hard as you have, and not just early in the morning, probably late at night too.
No, they've been working very hard, and I've seen them at close quarters. In fact, the Sherpa meets ran for 3 or 4 days from 2 p.m. to 2 a.m. And I know how Mr. Kant and his team have been, and he credited them ably for solving especially the geopolitical matters. In terms of trade, we've seen how they've been working through the delegate level outcomes and at various levels. And they've clearly outlined that be it Chennai, be it Deccan, be it Goa, be it Jaipur, there were significant outcomes that were drawn at various levels. Vivek Wadhwa, the 5 points that Amitabh Kant highlighted from the statement, from the declaration: strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth, accelerating progress on SDGs, Green Development Pact for a sustainable future, multilateral institutions for the 21st century, and reinvigorating multilateralism. How would you read this? And then he underlined that women-led development was also given a lot of emphasis and has been given a lot of emphasis in the joint declaration.
Amitabh has done a wonderful job at summarizing the key challenges that all nations face. You know, if you step up, go up a couple of levels, don't worry about declarations and tiny details. The fact is that India has now regained its position in the world. India has always led the world. And for hundreds of years, while it was colonialized and literally, raped and pillaged, it developed an inferiority complex. For the first time ever, I'm seeing India now asserting itself and taking its role in the world and showing the confidence to lead. So this is just the beginning. Now I hope to see India leading the United Nations and leading in other efforts all across the world, not only in science and technology, but in every other aspect. Bringing our civilization back to the forefront of humanity. This is good for all of us.
Multilateral institutions for the 21st century. That means a complete overhaul of the UN, pushing for UN reforms next, and also significant changes with the WTO.
All of those, and then also using technology, because I know Amitabh has been fostering the use of technology to uplift India. We should do this globally. That we now have the ability to solve the grand challenges of humanity, and India can lead it. This is something I've spoken a lot to Amitabh about, and I know that this is going to be his next challenge. So India can lead in many, many, many ways. That's what the message over here is.
So we've got a lot of the leaders who are now slowly arriving for the dinner, and those visuals will come across, colorful visuals right behind us, about 500 meters away there at the base where you can see the crisscross of the pillars and the pillars standing there. That's where it's the base, and that's the main gate of entry, and that's the porch where they will all drive in. It's a fantastic sight getting in. But Vivekji, before I go across to Professor Victor Gao, one final question to you. This entire aspect of inclusivity, Sabka Saath, and demonstrating that via the economic corridor. How big a win is that to get so many nations together to participate in an economic corridor?
It's a huge win because in many nations now, like even in America, it's America first. It's every country is now trying to mimic what happened here of nationalism and selfishness. This is now all about humanity, and that's the beauty of what India has done here. It's taken a forum which was really mired in politics and brought it together. And the message is that we can bring humanity together and do good for all. That's the message I'm hearing over and over again. And the press that India is receiving all over the world is extremely positive, which is a really good change from the negativity we've seen over the last few years.
The Trans-African Highway is also part of this project, so that's also been mentioned in the joint declaration.
It's all about uplifting humanity.
States or nations across Africa.
Yes, it's all about uplifting humanity, and that's the amazing thing over here. It's not selfishness, it's not nationalism. It's about doing good for the world, doing good for everyone. Inclusivity, as you've been saying. This is the key message that India has brought.
Professor Victor Gao, how would you see it? Many are questioning the absence of President Xi while discounting the presence of Premier Li.
No, I think China attaches great importance to the G20 Summit this time in New Delhi, and the fact that the Chinese Prime Minister Li Qiang attended the meeting shows and reinforces that China attaches great importance. President Xi Jinping is very busy handling many international issues as well as domestic issues. He visited Heilongjiang, which was suffering from the aftermath of large-scale flood brought by typhoon. And I think whether Xi Jinping or Li Qiang attending the G20 summit in India, China attaches equal importance to the role to be played by G20. And it is demonstrated that China also signs up with the Delhi Declaration. And I think this is very much in line with China's policy that G20 should focus on what matters for G20, that is the economic development, financial development, rather than diverting its attention to other issues to be handled by the United Nations Security Council. And the Delhi Declaration reinforces this point, that is, G20 should very much focus on its original mandate.
But the Delhi Declaration also says that geopolitics does impact economic equations and relations. But Professor Gao, I'd like to ask you, what's happening on the sidelines of the G20, where nations are coming together for this transnational and transcontinental economic corridor? How does...
for this corridor...
Isn't it a direct challenge to the One Belt, One Road? Yes, please.
No, I think connectivity projects everywhere should reinforce each other. And I personally wholeheartedly support this idea of building up a corridor linking India with the Middle East and Europe. And I don't think it conflicts with China's proposal for the Belt and Road Initiative. As a matter of fact, the more roads you build, the greater connectivity there will be. And for this corridor to be a success, one key thing you need to take care of is to narrow the differences between India and Pakistan, because Pakistan straddles in the middle between India and the Middle East and Europe. So I hope this initiative will really make bilateral relations between India and Pakistan better in the coming years.
Well, you'll have to see, because China has a key role to play in trying to keep the pot boiling, Professor Victor Gao. From 1971 onwards, there is evidence to show that China has always played a tacit role in trying to keep the pot boiling because it serves its interests. Aksai Chin, POJK, Gilgit region, all of these are today under PLA control, and that is of strategic interest, and that's because the pot was kept boiling between India and Pakistan, Professor Victor Gao.
Well, there is no denying that there is territorial dispute between China and India in three sections: eastern section, middle section, and the western section. And I think it eventually will be resolved by wisdom and courage and vision demonstrated by China and India. I'm an optimist that eventually China and India will be able to reach peaceful negotiation and results and settlement of these territorial disputes. And China wants to have peace and stability and cooperation with India. And I do believe that the Chinese nation and the Indian nation, both counting for 1.4 billion people and more, are two great nations in the world, and both are shining examples of the global South. So why couldn't we overcome the differences and embrace each other as brothers and sisters?
That's because one wants to lead, the other is just a voice for everyone. One wants to claim territory that doesn't belong to it and even challenge sovereignty. The other does not want to do it, but it just claims what is rightfully its. So the attitude is different, and that's a simple point, that if India and China cannot have an economic corridor between these two nations, as you say, there is a lot left to be desired in terms of walking the talk, Professor Gao. I'll come back to you, sir. Just going back to Matt Weiser. Matt, President Joe Biden also was there in another picture that I didn't talk about, and that visual had the World Bank chief, had India Prime Minister, they had the Brazilian president, and also the South Africa head of state. So all of them were there in this picture. Is that a significant indication, because that was also mentioned in the press conference, the presidency briefing, that there will be significant infusion of funds so that debt can be serviced? The example of Chad was raised, and they said they'll help other African nations also to perhaps emerge out of debt. A direct hint at helping nations wring free from China's debt diplomacy.
Yes, there were two important things about that picture. The first is a policy perspective from the U.S., who's trying to inject more money through the World Bank to help developing countries. There's a proposal before the United States Congress for $3 billion that the U.S. believes will then increase in funds, and they're hoping other countries will get on board. The other thing that was important about that picture, according from the Biden administration, was that it was a picture that showcased the future heads of the G20, the hosts of the next three versions of the G20. And the U.S. And many of the countries here are trying to establish the relevance of the G20. There was some concern, given the absence of the Chinese president and the Russian president not being here, that it would lose a little bit of its relevance. And so the U.S. administration officials from Joe Biden pointed to that picture as a reason to show that this is an important alliance. It can still do important, relevant work. And you had the leaders of the countries of the next several G20s there together to demonstrate that they were in solidarity and promoting the G20 going forward, and that the work can be important that happens at these annual conferences.
Matt Weiser, thank you for your time. I'm going to take this conversation forward with Ambassador Leela Ponnappa and Vivek Wadhwa and Professor Victor Gao. Ambassador Leela Ponnappa, if we look at the trade corridor itself, how significant is it? Because each of the nations who are participating have a geopolitical stake in making this corridor happen too. Along with trade, there are other tugs and pulls which will get addressed.
I think any connectivity project, as one of the panelists mentioned earlier, is big and to be welcomed. The devil is always in the detail. Now, we've heard of connectivity projects earlier.
Yes.
If you recall the UNOCAL proposal for a pipeline, or a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan into India, which was the obvious market. That did not take off because of Pakistan's intransigence. And I don't know whether China tried advising Pakistan to come on board, but obviously nothing worked. There was also a proposal for the Oman-India gas pipeline underwater. But I think there were technical problems over there, and that did not come through. So now what we are looking at is a multimodal proposal. Rail, apparently, and I suppose there would be road as well, and there will be a sea bridge.
Yes.
And the point is, where does
Yeah.
it terminate? We told Saudi Arabia, but then after that, we heard so many other European countries saying they wish to come on board. And frankly, when I first heard about this, I
Yes.
said, where in Saudi Arabia is this going to start or end? Obviously, the answer would be that it goes through to the Mediterranean. And this again is an area of great interest to India because so much of our trade passes through the Mediterranean. And therefore, I think any such connectivity project, whether to our west, as in this, or to our east, where there are opportunities through Myanmar, northern Thailand, Laos to Vietnam, all the way up to Da Nang and the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. These are projects waiting to be done. The gestation period for these things sometimes tends to take a long time, but that's natural given that there are
Right.
different standards and laws and so on that have to be harmonized. But I think it's a big idea, and I think a connectivity project like this needs to be pursued because this is ultimately what will bring people together and create common stakeholders. And that is always a surefire
Would you read
guarantee
much?
of stability.
Would you read much meaning into the Prime Minister using the tag in front, name of the nation as Bharat? It's a continuum which started at BRICS and then with the Rashtrapati and now with the Prime Minister. Is it indicative of something? Will this have
Obviously, it's
huge
indicative
international
of something.
diplomatic ramifications ahead of UNGA?
Well, Article 1 of the Constitution is very clear in terms of India, that is Bharat. So we'll have to see how this works, how this progresses. At a very simple operational point, shall I say that it would then move India up from the I category to B, and therefore, if you follow the alphabetical order, we'd be
B.
an earlier speaker. But
So the rise of Bharat, so it also moves up alphabetically. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
One of your earlier speakers, Mr. Wadhwa, I believe, talked about India at some stage taking a slightly lower profile because it had developed an inferiority complex. I would question that. I don't think that was ever the case. India has had enormous challenges, and everything that we have done since independence has brought us to this point. I think what's the summit that has just taken place has obviously done great things, not just for Delhi, but for the rest of the country. And if you follow the processes that G20 has followed through their
Right.
working groups, through their engagement groups and so on, there's a lot of preparatory work that took place for this summit. When the NAM summit was held here, there were 90 plus
Right.
delegates, but it was a different India at that time. Our economy was not so strong. We had a whole lot of other challenges, but those have changed. And today, because our economy has positioned us where we are, despite ongoing challenges, I think the world has finally noticed, and I should say even India has realized that there are great assets over here, not necessarily just financial, but human, technical, and so on,
Right.
that give us an advantage of playing to an agenda that works not just for us, not just for developing countries, but also for developed countries. We are an investor in many developed
Yeah,
countries. We
it is
provide
true.
jobs. Our people pay taxes
and
over
somewhere,
them.
yeah, yes. And somewhere unwritten line where in English you would say India, in Hindi you would move to Bharat. So trying to erase that and say let's call ourselves Bharat because that's the ancient name, at least mentioned in the Vishnu Puran in 300 AD. So 2000-year-old name. The arguments between historians set aside, but that's something which is older than India that came into play sometime around 1947, just about 75 years ago. So that we'll park it to the side for a moment. Vivek Wadhwaji is with us. Falguni Shah is joining us. She wrote the Millet song, and it was the International Year of Millets. Millets and its mention also finds a mention in the joint declaration. But Falguni Shah, your thoughts on day one of the G20 summit, and especially the New Delhi declaration?
I think it's so wonderful that our country is doing this, hosting such a great summit and with so many great causes. I live here, so I have to yet to catch up to everything that's happening. But from what I've heard, it's about economic growth, it's about women empowerment, and also about climate change, which is very close to what we wrote the song for, millets, because millets, as you know, everybody knows in India that it's a supreme super grain that is grown in low rainfall regions. So for the future generations, the Prime Minister's vision was to use music to help end hunger with millets. So I feel like even today in the dinner they have millets, if I'm not mistaken. So I think towards climate change and towards the futuristic approach for children to not go sleep hungry, I think everything is getting aligned in such a beautiful way, and the leadership that India and Bharat is showing is infectious. I think everybody is looking at India for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we're at a great position right now.
Yes, food security is a big challenge along with climate change. Food security and millets do solve a lot of problems because they are a low-cost grain, they're a high-yield grain, and the issue of pesticides doesn't happen because pests don't infest them, and of course they consume far less water than the traditional staples. But Falguni Shah, I must ask you, how's your song doing? Is it reaching to a lot of people? Are more and more people getting more aware about the benefits of moving to millets?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, UN just had we just had a call, and it's going to be translated in many languages. At least the interviews that we have done to promote the millets all over the world, not just Asia, not just America, but everywhere where the planet is being threatened by droughts. So this is a universal helping project that we need to embrace, and everybody is getting aware of the strength of our millets that our Indian small farmers are growing and exporting to the world. So not only it benefits the economy of India, but it also feeds the world.
You have to do the millet song, at least 2 lines.
You want me to sing it?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll sing the Hindi part because, we're talking Bharat now. So,
yeah, sure.
Le lo bajri juwar, le lo ragi salo saal, सारे गुण से भरे हैं ये है बेमिसाल, किसानों को हम दे दे थोड़ा थोड़ा प्यार, ले लो राजनी, ले लो नाचनी जुवार, ले लो रागी सालो साल. Sorry, you put me on the spot.
Nachni, Ragi, Salu Sal. No, but you sound good as ever, Falguni Shah. But I'm just going to take this conversation forward along with to Vivek Vadvaji and ask him, these are options. Are these also green growth options? Are these also options where people can make money, profit here? In the sense, at the end of the day, you'd also want to do good for the planet, but you also want to make a living. Is this going to encourage? Are you a supporter of sustainable growth? Is this possible? Has India made that case? And especially with respect to food security, millets are the way, is what India has said. That's why we're calling it Sri Anna. But will the world embrace it?
Absolutely. And Falguni, I've just become a big fan of yours, by the way. I've got to go and check out your other music. But absolutely, I mean, this focus on millets is one example. I don't think people realize the type of research India is doing in basic things like agriculture. Everything from AI to quantum computing, India is now doing extensive research on. Indians all over the world are building these technologies. As well, India has developed things like UPI. UPI is light years ahead of anything in the West, and it's now beginning to share to the world. So in this infrastructure agreement, India will be building railroads and building all sorts of sophisticated technology infrastructure across different parts of the planet. These are things which are not being talked about, but that's the foundation for all of this. The fact that in every area you're talking about now, India has expertise, it has talent, it is leading the world already in building these things. So the answer is yes.
Absolutely. So there are plenty of sweet things
to
to
provide a lot of value.
Yeah, it should, and we're looking forward. Day one comes to a close with the cultural evening just getting underway, the dinner, and there is a cultural extravaganza. We should get the pictures coming through. It should last till about 10:30. A lot of positives, a lot of good energy, consensus, cohesion that was witnessed. Is that going to spill over into day two, and will there be an icing on the cake to actually look at it? We'll have to wait and watch. I thank all our panelists for joining us on this very special effort of the Right Stand this evening. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, ladies and gentlemen, soon after those declarations and the decisions that were made through the day, was in conversation with the ambassador of Djibouti to India, and also with Professor Salvatore Babanesh, author and sociologist. Stay with us.
That is left, and that is the reason why not only the Delhi police but also members of the ITBP and central police forces have also been deployed to make sure that there is absolutely no issue, or there is.
Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 a.m. movement from various hotels taking the heads of states and delegates to the Bharat Mandapam is beginning, and ahead of that security bandobast is being tightened further. You can see these are roads from near Hotel Oberoi, near Hotel Lodhi, and also the Claridges which hosts the French heads of state and the French delegation. So in that generic area, multiple layers of barricades have been put up. Delhi police is manning these barricades. Even people with valid I cards are not being allowed to move further. Till yesterday, even though this flyover takes you, this is still South Delhi, this is not New Delhi area, but until yesterday, people were being allowed to move, but today there are multiple layers of barricading here. Delhi police is here, paramilitary forces deployed as well. More barricades have been brought in, and they are ensuring that people don't really cross over this area. This will ultimately lead you to Bharat Mandapam. What is the drill that is being followed as far as movement of heads of states are concerned? Advanced security liaison has been conducted. There are security and liaison officers sitting with the heads of the security delegations of the various countries and really figuring out movements, etc. There are specific flags, specific routes that are marked. There are contingency plans as well. When a head of state moves from the hotel to the Bharat Mandapam towards the Pragati Maidan area, if there is an exigency, there are routes that have been marked as to where the driver, specially trained driver, can take the car carrying the heads of state. And here you see as police is stopping more and more vehicles, even checking the I card, even government I cards are being checked, and only then are they being allowed to move, but not being allowed to move further, as you see.
Approximately 200 meters away from the Bharat Mandapam, that is going to see all the head of states coming out here and attending this G20 Summit. And as you can see in the visuals over here, there is absolutely watertight security that can be seen on the ground. Absolutely no one is being allowed to enter the central Delhi area at this point in time unless they have the requisite passes and the requisite permissions. Senior officials of the Delhi police are on the ground making sure that the entire security arrangement is in place. Vehicles who are trying to move inside the central Delhi or the NDMC area from towards ITO, they are being checked, they are being frisked at different checkpoints that have been made out here, making sure that no unauthorized person is allowed to go inside the place where the G20 event is happening, or even anywhere close to the NDMC area, because remember, the movement of delegates have started, the movement of the head of states have started, and they are slowly reaching towards the Bharat Mandapam, from where the massive G20 event will start, which will actually pitch the idea of a new Bharat, a Bharat that is ready to take on the world. And that is what we are going to see over the next 2 days. You can see in the visuals over here that each and every person, either from the medical staff or from essential services, their passes are being checked, their ID cards are being checked, their passes for the vehicles are being checked, and post that they are being allowed to go inside, they are being allowed to go anywhere inside the NDMC area. And this is the kind of security that we have been reporting out here at CNN News 18, that there is absolute watertight security that can be seen on the ground, making sure that in this big ticket event there is no lapses. There is no loophole that is left, and that is the reason why not only the Delhi police but also members of the ITBP and central police forces have also been deployed to make sure that there is absolutely no issue or there is.
Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 a.m., movement from various hotels taking the heads of states and delegates to the Bharat Mandapam is beginning, and ahead of that, security bandobast is being tightened further. You can see these are roads from near Hotel Oberoi, near Hotel Lodhi, and also the carriages which hosts the French heads of state and the French delegation. So in that generic area, multiple layers of barricades have been put up. Delhi police is manning these barricades. Even people with valid I cards are not being allowed to move further. Till yesterday, even though this flyover takes you, this is still South Delhi, this is not New Delhi area, but until yesterday, people were being allowed to move, but today there are multiple layers of barricading here. Delhi police is here, paramilitary forces deployed as well. More barricades have been brought in, and they are ensuring that people don't really cross over this area. This will ultimately lead you to Bharat Mandapam. What is the drill that is being followed as far as movement of heads of states are concerned? Advanced security liaison has been conducted. There are security and liaison officers sitting with the heads of the security delegations of the various countries and really figuring out movements, etc. There are specific flags, specific routes that are marked. There are contingency plans as well. When a head of state moves from the hotel to the Bharat Mandapam towards the Pragati Maidan area, if there is an exigency, there are routes that have been marked as to where the driver, specially trained driver, can take the car carrying the heads of state. And here you see as police is stopping more and more vehicles, even checking the I card. Even government I cards are being checked, and only then are they being allowed to move, but not being allowed to move further, as you see.
Approximately 200 meters away from the Bharat Mandapam, that is going to see all the head of states coming out here and attending this G20 Summit. And as you can see in the visuals over here, there is absolutely watertight security that can be seen on the ground. Absolutely no one is being allowed to enter the central Delhi area at this point in time unless they have the requisite passes and the requisite permissions. Senior officials of the Delhi police are on the ground making sure that the entire security.
You've been following the developments very carefully. How important is this message of Sabka Saath, the message of inclusion, saying Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as he underlined this when he welcomed the African Union formally into the G20 as a permanent member?
The message is crucially important, and finally we'll have something practical coming out of a G20 meeting. The G20 is not known for having practical results, even going all the way back to the global financial crisis in 2008 when it was first founded. Yet here we have the African Union being brought into the G20. That's very, very important symbolically. South Africa has been a member of the G20 from the beginning, but South Africa can't speak for the entire continent. That's 55 countries that are members of the African Union. Now, that said, the African Union is not as cohesive a governance grouping as, for example, the European Union. So the African Union, there will be internal disputes within Africa over the message that Africa will take to the G20 in the future. But this is a tangible benefit nonetheless that will propagate through to future G20 meetings and hopefully to future global governance venues beyond the G20 itself.
Well, we've just got news that this G20, India's G20 presidency has perhaps been the most ambitious in the history of G20. For you, let me ask you, what perhaps is the biggest box that you would like ticked, or has the inclusion of the African Union already ticked that box, Professor Babanis?
Look, that symbolic box is really the best we can hope for. There's certainly not going to be a geopolitical consensus around the G20, even with Russia and China absent at the highest levels. Of course, they're both represented, but not represented by their top leaders. There won't be an ability to get a consensus around the table on anything really very tangible. So I think we should take away this African Union win as the big win. That said, this G20 meeting is not really about the G20. Let's face it, this G20 meeting is really about India. The star here is not the G20 or even the leaders who are present. The star here is not even Narendra Modi. The star here is India itself, the host country. This is India's coming out party, and I think everybody who's there is probably thrilled to be part of that. Joe Biden certainly is. Anthony Albanese, Australia's Prime Minister, certainly has cast it that way, and I think Indians should realize that as well.
Bilateral engagements are different, multilateral fora and multilateral understanding is different, the dynamic is different. Will India be able to emerge as the problem solver, Professor Babunez? And if India is able to do that, does that mean then it gets a reserved seat at the high table?
India is already a regional problem solver and increasingly sought after beyond its region. But India's seat at the high table is not some kind of reward for India doing good work at the G20. India's seat at the high table, and I believe that next table is going to be the G7. India's seat prospectively at the G7 is really about the success of India, the size of its economy, and the importance of India in the democratic world. I mean, the G7 is the coordinating body for the economic governance of the free world. Well, with India as the fifth largest economy in the world, as the fourth largest democratic country in the economy in the world, soon to be the second largest democratic economy in the world, but certainly by the end of this decade, the G7 is looking not very relevant without India. Now, India has been an observer the last few years. I strongly suspect that India, either at next year's meeting or the one after that, India will soon become an actual member, a formal member of the G7 grouping.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi using the tag of Bharat and not India, is that significant? Is that very important? How would you see that as a sociologist?
It is obviously politically relevant in India, and we're all waiting to see what comes of the special sitting of Lok Sabha after the G20 ends. Internationally, it really isn't that important. Many countries have different names by which they're known internally and externally. There was no controversy when Turkey started insisting on Türkiye as its name in international venues. Of course, what we know as the Ivory Coast is known as Côte d'Ivoire officially. Germany is Deutschland within Germany, but it's Germany for us, and it has different names in other countries. It's Alemania in French and Spanish. So for those of us outside India, what Indians decide to call themselves really is nothing we'll question. When they tell us that it's Mumbai, not Bombay, we just start saying Mumbai, or we may use Bombay for historical purposes, but it's not controversial outside India. Of course, inside India is where you'll have the big debate, and whatever Indians decide on this is something that the rest of the world will simply recognize and respect.
Namaste and thank you very much, Ambassador. My first question to you, the Africa Union now a permanent member of the G20. Your thoughts?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a special day today because African Union has joined G20, who will become G21, and we are very proud about it, and we are very thankful to the Prime Minister, to India first, and then to Prime Minister Modi for advocating for Africa and to be the voice of the global South. I am sure that without Africa, the world cannot go on, and without India, the world cannot go on. Now, the conjunction of these two forces, I think, will bring positive things to the world. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, if I may ask you, Djibouti is very strategically placed and there was a very close engagement with China. Today, Djibouti also finds itself in a debt trap. Do you believe nations need to come together to help such nations?
Well, first of all, let me tell you one thing. Djibouti is a sovereign country and has relation with all the world and all countries in the world. But I have to precise that Djibouti has very ancient relations with India, and there is a lot of community living in Djibouti, Indian community. When myself, I have been to school with 5 Indians, and up to now we are still friends from childhood up to now. So these ancient relations that are commercial ties since decades and centuries is bringing us to have new and more connected ties. more connected than before to bring development to Djibouti and to help India shine all over the world.
Do you believe the African nations should be more involved in the process of contributing to the global economy? Do you agree with India's pitch that emerging
Populated people are not in Western country. They are in Asia, in Africa. So putting aside those people will not help the rest of the world. At the opposite, it will even harm them because of migration, because of economical constraint, and because of resources, natural resources, human resources are on the Indian side and African side. So it will be very positive for them to cooperate and to give the priority of their cooperation with India or Africa or the global south, because we must not forget that half of the planet is composed, even more, is composed by the global south. Thank you.
Do you believe the World Bank should come together to help nations who are riddled with debt to try and help them service the debt and also emerge out of a financial crisis? Your Excellency?
I think that the chance of the so-called developer world is to have a strong Africa, a strong India, because now this is the time for global south to raise, and we can see the decline of the economy because of financial crisis of the so-called Western world or Northern world. So as many leaders have said from the West, now the next place to be is in Africa and India, and we can already see it with India, because India, 60% of the leaders of major CEO of major companies in America are Indian origin. So we can already see how the quality of Indian has been conquering the world. So Africa, with the opportunity given by this to be part of the G20 and to be part of the UN at the Security Council, this is what also another file that Mr. Prime Minister Modi is fighting for Africa to be present all the world at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and at the BRICS and at the G20 will also help balance the financial crisis.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of Brass Tacks, coming to you live overlooking the beautiful Bharat Mandapam, where the President of India is hosting a dinner for the world leaders of the group of 20 countries. It has been pretty much, I use the word historic very, very responsibly and very, very carefully, but indeed today has been a day of historic proportions, no doubt about it. Number one, the biggest takeaway, the New Delhi Declaration has been adopted and has been adopted by consensus. The big sticking point was the Ukraine war. It does find mention in the joint